In the autumn of 1958, I sat on a scholarship committee in a small town called Hardin, Ohio, and I watched four respectable men explain to a young woman's empty chair why her application had to be set aside, even though her grades were the highest the county had seen in 11 years. Her name was never spoken aloud in that meeting. They called her the Olmsted girl, as though naming her would have cost them something. I had been invited as a courtesy, a visiting speaker passing through on my way to a civic engagement in Columbus. A friend of a friend had arranged it. The committee chairman, a man named Lyle Burrows, thought my presence might add weight to the proceedings, give the whole thing a certain shine. I suspect he believed I would sit quietly, nod at the appropriate moments, and leave with a handshake and a photograph. I had done that before. I had done it more times than I care to remember. What I had not done, until that afternoon, was watch a girl lose her future because her father had once made a mistake that respectable men could not forgive. The meeting was held in a back room of the county courthouse. It smelled of old paper and floor wax. There were 6 of us seated around a long oak table, the kind they must have dragged in from the judge's chambers. The overhead light was too bright. I remember that. It gave everyone's face a kind of washed-out seriousness, like we were posing for something. Lyle Burrows sat at the head. He owned a feed supply company and 3 rental properties on the edge of town. Beside him was a man named Dietrich, who ran the bank. There was a school principal named Felton, a retired minister whose name I never caught, and a woman only one named Mrs. Haskell, who did not speak for the first 40 minutes except to say that she agreed with whatever had just been said. The scholarship was called the Hardin County Promise Fund. It had been endowed by a family that made its money in lumber before the Depression. It paid for 4 years at any Ohio college, and it had been awarded every year since 1931 to the graduating senior with the highest marks and the strongest character. That phrase appeared in the charter. Strongest character. I would come to understand what those words actually meant before the afternoon was over. The girl's name was Ruth Ann Olmsted. She was 17 years old. She had not missed a day of school since the 4th grade. She had earned the top score in every subject for 3 consecutive years. She had written a letter of application so direct and unadorned that I asked Burrows if I could read it twice. She wanted to study nursing. She wanted to come back to Hardin County and work at the clinic on Route 15, where her mother had been treated for pneumonia the winter before. There was nothing grand in her ambition. She did not want to leave. She wanted to stay and be useful. I thought that was rare. I thought that was exactly the kind of person the Promise Fund was meant to lift up. But when Burrows finished reading her file aloud, he set it down on the table and let out a long breath. And the room shifted in a way I did not understand until Dietrich spoke. He said, "We all know about Tom Olmsted." I did not. I had never heard the name, but every other face around the table tightened, as though a window had blown open and let in something cold. Felton, the principal, looked down at his hands. Mrs. Haskell folded her arms. The retired minister coughed and said nothing. I waited for someone to explain, but no one did. They assumed I knew. They assumed everyone knew. And so I asked. I said, "What about him?" Burrows looked at me with a kind of patient disappointment, as though I had asked why the sky was blue. He said, "Tom Olmsted was convicted of embezzlement in 1949. He served 3 years in the state penitentiary at Mansfield. He has been out for 6 years now. He works at the gravel yard outside of town. He does not attend church. He does not participate in civic life. His daughter may be bright, but the family does not represent the values this fund was established to honor." I let that settle. I looked at the file on the table. I looked at the girl's grades, her letter, her teacher's recommendation, which used the word remarkable twice. I thought about what it must have taken for her to write that letter, knowing what people in this room thought of her name. I asked if she had been involved in her father's crime. No one answered. I asked again. Burrows said, "Of course not. She was 11 years old." I asked if she had ever been disciplined at school. Felton said no. I asked if there was any evidence at all, that her character was anything less than exemplary. The room was quiet. Dietrich cleared his throat and said, "This is not about evidence. This is about what kind of message we send. The Promise Fund has a reputation. It means something in this county. If we give it to that girl, we are telling every family in Hardin that the standards have changed, that the past doesn't matter, that anyone can rise, regardless of where they come from," I said. I thought that was the point. He did not reply. Burroughs folded his hands and leaned forward. He said, "We understand. This may seem harsh to someone from outside our community, but we have a responsibility to the donors, to the legacy, to the families who have contributed to this fund in good faith. They expect a certain kind of recipient, a certain kind of family. We cannot simply ignore that." I asked who the second-ranked student was. Felton said it was a boy named Warren Dietrich. I looked at the banker. He did not blink. His son, of course. I asked what the boy's grades were. Felton said they were strong. I asked if they were as strong as Ruth Ann's. He hesitated. He said no. I asked if the boy had written a letter of application. He said yes. I asked what the boy wanted to study. There was a long pause. Felton said, "Business, I believe, or engineering. He has not quite decided." I asked if the boy intended to return to Hardin County. No one answered. I already knew. Boys like Warren Dietrich did not come back. They went to Columbus, or Cleveland, or Chicago, and they sent Christmas cards once a year, and that was the end of it. Ruth Ann Olmsted wanted to stay. She wanted to nurse the sick in the county where she was born, and she was going to be passed over because her father had made a mistake 9 years ago and served his time and never been forgiven. I did not raise my voice. I did not make a speech. I had learned long ago that speeches rarely changed anyone's mind, especially in rooms like that one. Instead, I asked a question. I asked Burroughs to read aloud the exact language from the charter regarding character. He hesitated. I asked again. He pulled out a worn sheet of paper and read, "The scholarship shall be awarded to the graduating senior who demonstrates the highest academic achievement and the strongest character, defined as integrity, perseverance, and service to others." I asked him to read it again. He did. I asked if Ruth Ann Olmsted had demonstrated integrity. Silence. I asked if she had demonstrated perseverance. Silence. I asked if her letter described a commitment to service. Silence. Then, Mrs. Haskell spoke for the first time. She said, "It isn't her fault, but it isn't fair to the other students either, to the families who did things the right way." I asked her what the right way was. She did not answer. I stood up. I did not plan to. I simply could not remain seated. I said that I had no vote on this committee and no authority over its decision. I said that I was a guest and that I was grateful for the courtesy of being included. Then I said that if the committee chose to pass over Ruth Ann Olmsted, I would not be able to stay silent about it. I did not say I would speak to the press. I did not say I would make a scandal. I simply said that I had been in enough rooms like this one to know what was happening, and that I could not pretend otherwise. Burroughs stared at me. Dietrich's face went white. The retired minister coughed again. Felton looked at his hands, and I saw something there I had not expected. Relief. He had wanted someone to say it. He just had not been able to say it himself. There was no vote that afternoon. Burroughs said the committee would reconvene the following week to consider all applications more thoroughly. I shook hands with each of them and walked out into the fading light of an October evening. I drove to Columbus that night and gave my speech the next morning, and never returned to Hardin, Ohio. I do not know what the committee decided. I never asked. I did not want to know, and I am not sure why. Perhaps I was afraid they had gone ahead without me and given the scholarship to the banker's son. Perhaps I was afraid they had changed their minds only because of who I was and not because of what was right. Either way, it would have meant the same thing, that the girl's future had been held hostage to something she could not control, that respectable men had gathered in a back room and decided what her father's mistake would cost her, that no one in that room, not one of them, had stood up until a stranger asked them to read their own words aloud. That evening, I stopped at a diner on the edge of town before driving on to Columbus. It was a small place with a counter and 6 booths, The kind where the coffee has been sitting too long and no one apologizes for it. I sat by the window and ordered a cup I did not want. The waitress was a woman in her 50s with tired eyes and a name tag that said Dolores. She did not recognize me, or if she did not say so. I was grateful for that. I watched the street outside. A boy rode past on a bicycle. A pickup truck pulled into the hardware store across the way. The town looked the same as it had when I arrived that morning, but it felt different now. I had seen what was underneath. I had seen the quiet machinery of exclusion, the way decent people could sit in a room and speak in reasonable voices while deciding that a girl's future was worth less than a man's reputation, or a name's respectability, or a family's standing in the eyes of people who had never once been tested. I thought about Tom Olmsted, the father. I did not know him. I knew only what Burroughs had said, that he had served his time, that he worked at the gravel yard, that he did not attend church. I wondered what kind of man he was. I wondered if he knew his daughter had applied for the scholarship. I wondered if he had told her not to, knowing what the town would say, or if he had encouraged her, hoping that her accomplishments might finally outweigh his failure. I wondered if he carried that hope every day, or if he had stopped hoping long ago. I did not know. I would never know. But I sat in that diner and I thought about what it must be like to live in a place where your worst moment follows you into every room, where your children inherit your shame the way other children inherit land or money. I thought about how easy it would be for Ruth Ann Olmsted to leave Hardin, Ohio, and never come back. I thought about how much harder it would be to stay, and I thought about the fact that she had chosen to stay, that her letter had said so plainly, that she wanted to come back and serve the very people who were now deciding she was not good enough to help. That was the part I could not stop thinking about. She wanted to give something to a town that had already taken so much from her family. She wanted to be useful to people who did not believe she deserved the chance. That kind of generosity is rare. I have seen it in a few people over the years, and I have never understood where it comes from. It is not taught. It is not rewarded. It simply exists in some people, like a kind of quiet stubbornness that refuses to let bitterness take root. I finished my coffee and left $1 on the counter. Dolores nodded at me as I walked out. I drove through the dark for 2 hours, and I did not turn on the radio. I let the silence fill the car. I thought about the committee reconvening the following week, about Burroughs sitting at the head of that long oak table, about Dietrich and his son, about Felton looking at his hands. I thought about what they would say to each other once I was gone and the pressure of my presence had lifted. I thought about how easy it would be for them to convince themselves that they had been right all along, that standards had to mean something, that the past could not simply be erased. I thought about how rarely people change their minds when no one is watching, and I thought about Ruth Ann Olmsted, somewhere in that town, not knowing what was being decided for her, not knowing that her name had been spoken in a room full of men who would never meet her, who would never read her letter the way I had read it, who would never understand what it had cost her to write it. I think about her sometimes. Ruth Ann Olmsted. I think about what she might have become if she had been given the chance. I think about what she might have become if she had not. I never met her. I never saw her face. I only saw her file, her grades, her letter, her name written in neat handwriting at the top of the page. And I think about the men in that room, how certain they were that they were doing the right thing, how easily they had convinced themselves that protecting the fund's reputation was the same as protecting its purpose. They were not cruel men. That is what I have had to accept. They were not villains. They were simply men who had decided, without ever quite saying it, that some people's children mattered more than others. And that is the kind of injustice that never announces itself. It sits quietly in back rooms, dressed in reasonableness, and it waits for someone to notice. Most of the time, no one does. Most of the time, the meeting ends and the files are closed, and the decision is recorded in a ledger that no one ever reads again. I do not know if my presence made any difference. I do not know if speaking up changed a single thing, but I know that I could not have walked out of that room without saying something, and I know that the girl deserved better than silence. She deserved better than to have her future weighed against her father's past by men who had never carried anything heavier than a reputation. I left Hardin, Ohio, with nothing settled. That is often how it ends. That is often all there is.